Hello everyone, and welcome back to Rudy's 1/6 World for another installment in our new figure showcase series. And for today's episode, we'll be looking at the 6th scale Shang-chi figure released by Hot Toys from Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. And it does feel like it's been a while since we've looked at a newer release. And even though this one was released a month or so ago, it's just starting to make its way to the States. And speaking of slow releases, I'm still waiting for my Sam Wilson cap, which was also released and just got delayed again. But hopefully we'll be getting more new releases as the year progresses. So, Shang-Chi was the second movie released in Phase 4 of the MCU, following Black Widow. And even though people seem to have mixed feelings about Phase 4, I think Shang-Chi was universally liked, and it is a really strong movie in the MCU, and a great introduction for the character into the universe as well. And the movie included one of the more sympathetic villains in Wenwu, who I also have on pre-order, and fingers crossed Sideshow does get the suited version for pre-order. So, as you can tell, I did enjoy the movie, and when they announced the figures, I jumped on the pre-orders. And switching the conversations to figure collecting. I love collecting the MCU classics, and by that I mean the different versions of Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Black Widow, and so on. But one of the great things about the MCU is the opportunity to see some characters make the jump from page to screen. And as a collector, I love adding those new characters to my MCU setup. So even before getting the figure in hand, I was pretty excited. So with that preamble out of the way, let's start by looking at the package we got here from Hot Toys. And I'll start by saying, this is an MMS release, but it does feel almost like the previous DX releases, or what they used to be, just with the sheer number of accessories he includes. Sometimes when opening figures, you get a sense immediately if something is going to be a standout. And as I was removing all these items from the trays, I had that feeling with this figure. I mean, the figure itself looks incredible, but then all the additional effects you get to be used with the rings. First of all, the size of these is pretty astonishing, and the work that was done just really makes them stand out. So when you see everything laid out, the first thing I see is a world of possibilities in terms of posing. And granted, I may not be the most creative person when it comes to poses and articulation, but I can see the chances provided here. So the overall release out of the box just feels incredible, and I do have to give credit to Hot Toys for what they're providing here. And last bit is, you're getting a flexible flight stand, so you can definitely pose up the figure in really dynamic ways. So let's start by looking at the accessories in closer detail. And first up are the spare hands. And again, comparing to older releases, you can see how Hot Toys has evolved in giving us a lot more options. And with a figure like Shang-Chi and trying to recreate martial arts poses, it makes sense to get all these hands. And the paint apps here are excellent, capturing that more realistic skin tone with even some freckling on the hands. Next up, you get a really cool set of switch out forearms, and I guess if you've collected some of the Star Wars Jedi figures, this shouldn't be new to you, since those included the same kind of switch outs for their light up features. But here I think it might be the first time a Marvel figure includes it, and both hands have the rings attached. So I like it because it gives you a nice look, letting you pose the figure without having to worry about futzing around with the rings too much. And the paintwork here on the rings is just gorgeous, with the metallic bronze and gold bands. So a great set of accessories. Next up, you get the 10 rings themselves, and just as expected, they're beautifully done here with amazing paint work, similar to what we saw in the swappable forearms. So I am a little curious how I'm going to use these. As you'll see shortly, there are some magical effect pieces that are meant to hold these rings, but part of me wonders if that's the case, why not just have them on already? But I guess you can also pose the figure holding them. Regardless, they're beautifully recreated here. Next up, he has his necklace, which is nicely done here as well, with the green gems sitting on a silver frame. Not much else to say here, other than it's a nicely done piece and an important one to the overall story from the movie. The next set of accessories are two staffs, with the difference being the cap pieces at either end. First one is a pure staff with a metallic scale-like tip that really shimmers under light, so great paintwork here. The center portion of the staff is sculpted and painted with a wood grain pattern, so overall it looks really impressive and matches the figure's costume. The second staff is identical except for the end pieces, which still have the scale-like pattern work, but are slightly more translucent to mimic the battle effects we saw on screen. They're also both pretty long, so if used in posing, I do think they're going to claim up some valuable real estate. Now let's jump into the real highlight here for me, and that's the magical effects. You get two elements that go over his arms and almost look like blast effects, so I'll call them the blaster effects during the review. And then you get this very long piece that looks almost like lightning holding some of the rings in place. So the ring pieces all have that same great paintwork and detail work we saw earlier, but the effects really do stand out. They're not just single colored plastic pieces. Instead, there's a lot of variation here in terms of colors, with some light zones and some darker zones, giving the piece a very dynamic feel. I do know that some collectors do think these pieces can make the figures feel a little cheaper, but I love them. I think they bring the figures to life a little bit, and when you see the pattern and the color work on these, they just give you a visual pop. Now the last two are these really incredible looking flame effects that can connect to the figure's fists and even to his feet, and they look phenomenal. First of all, at the connection points, these things are really orange and big, looking like the bottom of an open flame, all tapering to a very thin, almost clear plastic end. So again, that color variation really does bring the piece to life. Now those rings we saw earlier, you can actually add them into this piece to have the rings essentially floating inside the flames. So that's a nice touch as well. So overall, like I said, it's a great looking set with all of these pieces making it feel deluxe. So now let's switch to the figure itself, and we'll start with the sculpt. And there's no need to beat around the bush. The sculpt looks great. I mean, it's why I think we gravitate towards Hot Toys, because when they deliver, they really do deliver. I mean, this looks like Simu Liu. And look, I do have a little bit of a harsh light on him, so some of the finer detail work might be lost, but you can see the slight shadow of the facial hair and the detail work around his forehead and his chin and ears, and that's only helped by the amazing paint work that's done here, capturing some skin tone variations as well. And the eyes, I've said it before, but those are key to help us collectors feel like the figures are more realistic, and when you look at this sculpt, it's another home run from Hot Toys. As a small aside, it's amazing to me that the last three sculpt reveals seem to be an even bigger improvement over what we're seeing here, because this one by itself looks amazing, and I'm hard pressed to imagine having a better sculpt, but Hot Toys seems to be delivering that, so sky seems to be the limit on these guys. Now as for the body and the costume, again, just fantastic tailoring work here, and I do like the black and scarlet red jacket he wears, and I like that it's a textured piece instead of just screen printed fabric. There's a nice element to it, again, almost making it feel scale like, and it just adds another dimension to the figure, making it feel very much three-dimensional. Even the pants, which are just black pants, have some very nice stitch work and detailing on them, and of course that all culminates in the really nicely sculpted sneakers. And as a small added bonus, there is some weathering and scuffing on the white soles of his shoes, so another little detail that helps add to the realism Hot Toys is trying to recreate here. One of the other things I like about the clothing set here, the pieces aren't restrictive. It does feel like Hot Toys thought about this, and even the connection between the arms and the body seems to be separate pieces to really avoid hindering the articulation. And for this figure, that's a plus, as I think you're really going to try to get some dynamic poses going. Same with the pants, not restrictive at all. So again, kudos to Hot Toys for thinking about a way to make the figure really work and still look good. So, as we look at some poses with this figure, I think the first thing that just comes to mind is that not only do the accessories make it feel like a deluxe release, but the figure poses extremely well, having double jointed elbows and double jointed knees, so you can really ratchet these a little bit. Sometimes with 6 scale figures, there could be releases that feel a little by the book, so to speak, and others that feel like a lot of care was taken into putting them together, and this figure definitely feels like the latter. The accessories and the figure itself all work together so seamlessly, and the attire just works well with the poses. You know someone really thought about how this was going to feel overall. Looking at some of the effects, I cannot wait to get Wenwu in hand just to pose these two together, because I think the contrast between the oranges and the yellows and the blues that come with Wenwu are really going to stand out and be striking from a visual perspective. There are a few issues or concerns though that I have to point out. First one for me was the swappable forearms, and you'll notice I don't have any shots with him using those, and that's only because I tried but wasn't able to remove the current set of forearms he has. The instructions do say you can push the arm back to make the removal of the arm easier, but it just felt like a break waiting to happen. I may revisit when I keep posing this guy, but I just felt concerned, so while not a negative, definitely something worth noting and taking your time with. The other thing I noticed is with the effects in place, he does take up a lot of display space, and once you combine him with the newly released Wenwu, I think that space requirement is only going to increase if you do choose to pose them together or have them in anything other than a museum pose. So just something to consider. But again, for me personally, it would be such a shame to not display this figure with some of these accessory pieces, because while the figure again looks amazing by itself, those accessories really do bring him up a huge level. But not all effects are equal, and while they look great out of the box, there are some that do look a little more strange And while I do think overall effects can make figures look real, there are some that might not accomplish that off the bat. And those are namely the blast effects with the rings shooting off of the figure's forearms. The way the piece is meant to assemble is at first you put in the small wrist effects, which look great by themselves, but then you remove the hands and peg in the larger pieces. And by peg in, I mean they slide into those wrist connections. So it's just a pressure connection, and I found that more often than not the heavier piece started to sag a little bit. Maybe with more futzing you can get it to look better, but it almost feels like it would have been better to have those effects actually use the peg from the wrist and peg into that, similar to what the Captain Marvel figures did with the heavy blast pieces. The other ring effect requires you to have the figure hold the rings. Again, it's doable and it looks great, but it's a little challenging to get the figure posed up properly, and you want to be careful to avoid having the rings break off the effect, which seems like a possibility if you were to manhandle the piece and not pose the hands the right way. So for me, they look great, but the standout effects are definitely those big pieces that attach to his fist or his forearms, showing the rings trailing behind. They just work really well with the figure and they look incredible. I think they're the best looking effects we got here. Now it's interesting that we haven't gotten other figures from this line, and maybe not from Hot Toys. I wouldn't necessarily expect them to tackle anything but the big characters from this line, but I'm surprised third-party companies haven't jumped in here. For example, you had the Death Dealer, which looked incredible, and it's not an overall complicated figure. Same thing with Razor Fist, again, not complex figures, and it seems like something third parties would just jump at, but it's been a few years now and nothing. So I'm just curious why they opted not to tackle these characters, especially when you consider the overall positive reception here to the movie. But again, this is a great release from Hot Toys. It's one that didn't actually make my top 5 list of anticipated releases, but opening it up and being able to just play with the figure a little makes me feel like this figure is definitely in the running for the top 5 of 2023. It just looks incredible, poses amazingly well, and I feel like I barely pushed what I could do with him. So I think with patience, you can get some really standing poses. So I'm really happy to have him and hope that Hot Toys keeps up this degree of quality with their MC releases. So that was a quick look at Shang-Chi released by Hot Toys. I'm curious to know what you think of this figure and if you're as enthralled by it as I was, because it really is a lot of fun to pose up. And again, as always, thanks for watching, and if you are enjoying the content, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, and we'll touch base on the next video.